So we've been noodling around with the topic of finding the purpose of your life. And maybe not everybody, but I think most people at some point come to their life and they ask themselves the question, why am I here? Why was I created? Is there any reason other than my own existence or fulfilling my own pleasures and desires that I was created? And the Bible says that you were created for a purpose and that you were created for something more than just satisfying your own curiosities or satisfying your own pleasures, that you were created for something greater than that. And so we've been talking about this topic. In the first week we talked about a word. How many of you remember the word? Hineni. He, like a man, neigh, like a donkey makes, and a knee. Hineni. And that word means to be present, to be attentive, to be paying attention, to be in tune with what's happening around you so that you sense what's happening. It also has the sense of being willing to change to a different direction. It's the word that the prophets said when Jesus said, "Who will I send?" And the prophet said, "Here, my Lord, send me." It's the word that Samuel said when he heard God's voice, "Here, my Lord, what can you say to me?" It's also the word that some prophets didn't say. For example, Jonah. Jonah was supposed to say, "Hineni," instead he turned and ran. And so there were serious consequences to not saying Hineni when God calls us as well. But Hineni is an important part of being malleable. And then the second part was knowing God's vision. And we read the passage of Jesus where he talks about God is a rescuer, God is a redeemer, God is someone who is interested in redeeming his creation, that we live in a broken world with broken people. And his intention is to rescue people. That's his heart. And Jesus tells the parable about the poor and the sick and caring for those who are helpless and for those that need the gospel, the good news that Jesus is here, that God is here to rescue them, to provide you meaning and purpose and a point in your life. And so those all things are important. But then you come to the place and you ask yourself the question, well, how do I know that it's God speaking to me? How do I know it's God that's put this in my heart and not just a commercial about sick cats or whatever? How do I know that it's God and that it's not just some passing emotion that I have, that my brain has gone askew or whatever? And so this morning we're going to talk about how to discern God's voice, how to hear God's voice. And I appreciated very much Lillian's comments about listening for God in the quiet, because I think that's a very, very important part of being able to sense God's presence, is learning to hear him in the quiet moments of your life, and that's often when he speaks. But I want to talk about hearing God's voice, and to do so I want to take you to a very familiar story. It's in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. It's Moses and the burning bush. And you all know the story of Moses, or I presume that you do. Moses, probably seen it in the movies and many other places, reenacted, sometimes somewhat accurately. And, he was rescued from death and floated in a little basket in the river and rescued by a princess. And so he grew up in the Egyptian courts. And then as a young man, we don't know how old he was, but a young man, he got into trouble and he fled off into the wilderness, into the north somewhere in the area of Midian, and ran into a man who had only daughters. Terrible, tragic thing. And ended up marrying one of them. And just figured that he would live out the rest of his life there as the son-in-law of a sheep farmer, raising sheep and goats. And he's along in his life at this point. Understand that he is nearing 80 years old when this happens. So this isn't the story of a 30-year-old. This is an 80-year-old. And so that tells you that God is it's never too late. It's never too late to have God shift and change your life and take you off in an entirely new direction. And if you're saying the word Hineni, and if you have the passion of God to rescue, God can speak to you at any moment. And there may, I just want to say that God's vision may be something which consumes your whole life. That from the time you leave college, you know the purpose of your life. I was listening to a blog this week about a young man. He was 14 years old. And he'd just been spurned by the girl of his love, and he was walking home in the morning, and God said to him, "I want you to build hospitals and orphanages and schools." And he set off on a course, and his organization now, Oasis, started in England. It's actually all over the world now. They actually run schools, they run hospitals, then they have refuge centers for homeless all over the world. In fact, the government comes to him and said, we have schools that we cannot do anything with. They're just disasters. And they give him the school. And he takes it over and he turns it around because he pours hope into these kids' lives. Incredible thing. So his whole life has been this journey of rescuing. You may have many of those journeys in your life. Some people it's a lifetime, some people it's just for a season. But you need to constantly be in tune with God, and there may come a point where God says, okay, I'm done with you here, and now I'm going to lead you off in this direction. So that's part of it. But anyway, so here's Moses. He's almost 80 years old, and he sees this thing on the side of the hill. He's raising sheep, and he sees this burning bush. And it says there, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this sight. So there he is. He's malleable. He's willing to move. He's willing to go in a different direction. I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush did not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look. So see, God's waiting. God's waiting for you to have that point in your life where you say, okay, I'm willing to take the risk. I'm willing to go in this direction. Then God speaks. So that's really an important part of hearing God's voice. If you are at that place where you're willing to see something different, if you're not at that point in your life where you're willing to take a risk and say, okay, I might be willing to do this, then God's going to wait. You'll be silent. You'll sit there in frustration, waiting for God to speak. And God's just saying, yeah, as soon as you're ready to move, I'll begin to speak. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God calls him from the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, here am I. Hineni. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place that you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So one of the things that you can be assured of is that God won't ask you to do anything which is out of his character, which is out of his nature. He won't ask you to do something which is contrary, which is unethical, which in a sense is leading people to destruction. He will not put you in a course in your life which is causing in any way harm to the environment or other people. If something like that is happening, then you need to question yourself whether or not this is God leading you into this way. Is this the course of God in your life? Am I involved in the process of redemption, or am I simply a part of the problem? So he is the same God. He is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. This is who I am. This is my character. This is my nature. I am the God of rescuers. So he's identified himself. And then he talks about these people who he sees. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. And then Moses, I'm jumping down a bit, Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So one of the things that you can be sure of is that God will speak to you in areas in which you feel inadequate. It's often not in your strengths that God speaks to you, it's in your weaknesses. It's in the very areas you think, I could never do that. And God will say, yeah, I think that's exactly what I want you to do. That's exactly how I gifted you. And I don't know whether it's the enemy or what it is that makes us so fearful of the very strengths that God has put in us to resist those things. But that is our human nature, to resist those areas where God really wants to use us. So the story goes on, and there's this dialogue back and forth. I'm not going to read it all. It's a long story, and it's an amazing story. But it finally gets to the bottom line, and he gives Moses all of these magic events, these magical things that he can do to convince people. He's got a staff that turns into a snake. He can turn water into blood, and various things. And he can put his hand in his coat and bring it out, and it's all disease. He puts it back, disappears. So, it's just great illustrations of the power of God. Great magic, true magic. And Moses is still. beside himself. I mean, this is kind of overwhelming. You know, he's been raising sheep and been pretty happy out there with this beautiful young lady raising sheep and children. And God wants him to go back where it was terrifying and where there was threat of losing his life. And so he finally says to him, you can take along your cousin Aaron. In fact, Aaron is on his way to meet you right now. So one of the ways that you can know that it is God that's speaking to you is that God will start to bring the resources into your life. God will start to give other people the same vision. God will start to give other people the same fashion. Not everyone. That's really important to acknowledge and to recognize that God's not going to give all of you the same vision and passion. Not everyone in this room has a call of God to work with refugees. Not everyone in this room has a call to work with our youth group, thank God. I love our youth group, but I'm not gifted to work with youth people. I knew that from the time I graduated from high school. I'm so thankful that God has given some of you a passion to do that. Not all of you have a passion to work out in the gardens. Not all of you have a passion to do firewood. There are lots of different ministries, and God doesn't give every ministry to every person. But if God asks you to do something, he will provide the resources for that to happen. You can trust him that. That's one way that you can know this is God leading me. Suddenly people will say, you know what, I have that exact same passion. That's where my heart is too. When in January of 1970, I was a lost young man. It was in the height of the Vietnam War. I was about to be drafted, and I was sent down to Seattle to have my physical. And after that, I was planning to enlist because I didn't want to be drafted. And in the midst of my physical, I had to give blood. I walked into the next room. I sat in a chair, and I was sitting there with a bunch of other young men. And next thing I remember, waking up, I was on a table, on a bed. I have no idea. Something happened from the time I sat down, and I woke up on a bed. And the officer who was in charge, he was just in a panic. He said, hey, it's okay, don't worry. I'm just going to sign you off. You don't have to worry about serving the military at all. And I'm laying there thinking, I don't know what just happened, but it's probably a good thing. So I went home. I presumed that I fainted, but I don't know. I honestly, to this day, have no idea if I had convulsions or if I had a seizure or what happened. I've given blood since then. I've never fainted. So, at the time, I was not following God by any means. I long hair, unkept, no direction in my life, and I was not following God. I was in a God-fearing family, but I was not following God. Later that same month, my cousin and her husband were home on furlough from serving in Ecuador as missionaries, and we got together with them, and he said, hey, why don't you come down to Ecuador and live with me for a while? I thought, I don't know what else to do. Okay. So I bought a one-way ticket to Ecuador, all the money I could scrape together, and while I was down there, lived down there for 4 months, and one day, I can remember that day as clearly as anything in my mind. I was standing, I can tell you exactly the spot I was standing. I was overlooking this valley with one of the Amazon basin rivers, looking down there, and it was cloudy, and I just felt the presence of God so powerful in my life, and he just changed my heart at that moment. And I remember walking back to the house, and I'd missed dinner. I'd been gone for hours. They didn't know where I was, and they said later that something had happened to me. They could see that something had happened to me, and I changed from that day, and my parents could see a difference in my letters from that day on, the letters I wrote home. And the interesting thing is that I gave my heart to God, and I said, I'm willing to serve you, and I presume that means that I'm going to be a missionary. And not only that, the people that I loved the most down there were the MAF pilots. So I was determined that I was going to serve God as an MAF pilot. So I came home, and I applied to Moody Bible Institute and wanted to go into their aviation program. And I was rejected. Moody didn't want me. And I was devastated because I was convinced that God had set me on this course, that this is what he wanted me to do. I had this passion, I had this willingness, I was going to do this. And the doors started closing. And suddenly I realized, and I came to find out later, that you can't be a pilot with strabismus anyway. I didn't know that. You have to have three. You have to be able to have depth perception. And you land in the jungles. I figure you just kind of close your eyes, and when you hit the ground, you're landed. It's muddy and soft. But anyway, it never occurred to me until many, many years later I could never done that. But obviously God was closing those doors and said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not where you're going to serve me. And curiously, when we went to later, I got married and went to seminary. And during seminary, I was a missions candidate. And in fact, Gene and I were approved to be missionaries, and they were just simply waiting for us to determine a country for where we were going to go. And we came to Kent and started our home assignment. We had to serve in a church for 2 years. And during that 2-year time, God told me that we were not even going to be missionaries. And we weren't going to serve overseas at all. And I remember how devastating that was and how difficult that was for both of us, because we were sure this was the course that God was taking us down. And I don't know why he waited so long to close the door, but he let us in that area for years, literally, with that mindset before he said, no, that's not what you're going to do. A curious thing that happened during that time is I got a lot of construction experience. And so here I have all this construction experience. I have a passion for missions, and God puts me as pastor of a church. And then he starts opening doors for this church to start going on missions trips all over the world. And we literally fly into some of those same airstrips in Ecuador on MF planes from the same place that I'd gone to in the 70s. And when you follow God, when you know it's God's voice, God opens and closes the doors and makes it very clear. And he provides the resources. He provides the people. He'll provide the direction. He'll give you the gifts that you need to accomplish the task that he sets before you. So hearing the voice of God isn't like an out loud somebody talking to you. Most often it's circumstantial. It's a feeling. It's an impression. And then the impression, the feeling is confirmed by events. You can't always trust the feelings. You can't always trust the passions. You may sit in a service and be overwhelmed by a need, and that's what you want to do with your life. But God doesn't provide any resource for you to do that. Another time you may hear something casually, and you say, "Wow, I wonder if that's it." And then God starts opening the doors. So, a very important a very important factor of hearing God's voice is, first of all, being willing to listen, and then being sensitive to what's around you. It's important to understand and to realize that truth always comes from God. It doesn't matter where it's coming from, it doesn't matter where the source of it is. If it's truth, ultimately it's from God. It doesn't matter if Satan says it. If it's truth, Satan can say truth. And if it's truth, it comes from God. So you can hear God speak to you in myriads of ways. And he's rescuing people in myriads of different ways around this planet. And he's rescuing the planet myriads of different ways. And so as we're in tune to that, and as we're willing to be molded and shaped and to go down any path, God will open, close doors, and provide resources to lead you to the place that he wants you to go. Some of you already know where God's taking you right now. Some of you are sitting here in the seat this morning wondering. And I can assure you that God has a plan. God has a voice for you. God has a mission for you. God has a mission for us. And we are all part of it together. It's an amazing thing to not only to live, but to live with a purpose and to serve a God of purposes. Stand together. Let me bless you with a benediction. May the God of Abraham, of Jacob, of Isaac, of Moses, of those missionaries in Ecuador, of those faithful men and women who have served you around the planet for thousands of years, may that God bless you and to open your eyes to the reason you were created. Amen.